My pleasure to be invited back. I'm honored and surprised. Usually I do my work so well that I don't get invited back for meetings. And I figured that once was enough, but I am honored to be back up here. I tried to bring all the Arizona sunshine with me, and it lasted through my trip down here. Woke up this morning, and it's over. But God controls that, not me. For those that are visiting, I want to just take a few minutes. I was supposed to be here some years ago, and I had to call and cancel my meeting. We had been having some problems with my wife's health, and she had gotten the diagnosis from the doctors that she had Lou Gehrig's disease. And it devastated us. In fact, I get choked up just thinking about those days. The average life is about 3 years after that diagnosis. And my first question to the doctor is, can you be wrong? And she said, I could be, but I'm not. The good news is she was. And so we've discovered that whatever went on, and they have no idea, but the phrenic nerve that controlled my wife's diaphragm that helps you breathe died. I don't know what the technical medical term is for that, but her diaphragm does not work. So I'm a little test for you all while I'm preaching and you need something else to do. I want you all to try to breathe without using your diaphragm this morning. Guarantee you cannot do it. And yet her body has responded, and the rest of the muscles, we are fearfully and wonderfully made indeed, and the rest of her muscles have taken over that job. But those muscles get tired, and so she will always be very limited on her breathing ability, but she's functionally normal. She drives, she takes classes, and she visits friends and takes trips with me. We don't drive too long at one time. So I just thank all of the members here, your prayers during that time, and it means a great deal. Y'all may not have thought about it, but I thought about you and so many friends around the world. Thankful that she is well enough now that I can again do meetings, and that I can come and see friends from far away, and have made a couple trips back over to China. She's able to function. She's able to function without me, and I don't know if that's good or bad, but it's good for her on that. When I talked about coming back up here, one of the things that goes through my mind, I have lived in Arizona for now 38 years, and Arizona is a weird country. I'm not sure we're really part of the United States at times. We don't do daylight savings time, so we're very fortunate. But my point is, what I'm teaching down there, does it apply to you all up here? And the answer is, my understanding and experience has been this series of lessons that I'm going to talk with you about, they're just simply applicable to our whole American way of life. And as we go through that, it's the foundations of life that we build on. I call them a worldview, and most of us don't use that vocabulary. So if I ask you what your worldview is, most of us go, I don't know what he's talking about. Worldview is basically those fundamental beliefs that are no longer arguable to you. They're arguable to the world, but they are the foundation beliefs that all other choices and beliefs and thinking rest upon. And we all have those. And there are just some things that are absolutely at the bottom of all of our thinking and our doing and our actions, so much so that we usually don't even think about that. And what's happened in the world is our world has changed. And what's happened in the world, our foundational beliefs used to be shared by most everybody. But now in American society, that's not true. And your foundational beliefs as a believer in God and believer in Jesus are becoming radically different than the foundational beliefs of your neighbors. And yet, they're our neighbors. And so we're going to have discussions with them. And I get up early in the morning. My wife sleeps in late because of her physical problems. And rather than knock around the kitchen, I just go down to Starbucks. And they open at 4:30 in the morning, which is very good because that's when I'm usually up. And I can spend 3 hours down at Starbucks and free Wi-Fi and expensive coffee and lots of conversations. People come through and use that. And what I found is I'm weird. But then so are you. Or as Peter said, we are a peculiar people because our viewpoints and our foundation is just totally different. And we need this absolute foundation in order to talk to people. And so a lot of the discussions we have are going to center around what is acceptable behavior. And we talk about those on a position of moral standards. And when people find out that I'm a preacher, one of the first questions that usually gets asked is, well, is it all right to, and then they'll finish that sentence with something, whatever it may be. And I have learned that 40 years ago, I started preaching when I was 6, and so, but I could give an answer and people went, oh, okay. And now when I give that answer, they get red in the face, belligerent. You can't believe that. That is so old-fashioned. Well, I'm an old man. Get over it. And the problem comes is, how do we have this discussion? How do we talk about what is morally acceptable in a country that is radically, quickly changing all of their moral standards and moral beliefs? And this is going to be our challenge. First of all, I'm just going to tell you up front, nothing has changed as far as God is concerned. God's book, God's rules, God's character, it hasn't changed a whit. And so the teaching that we believe is foundational is not changed in spite of our country and where we live. So when we talk about the idea of moral standards, we have to have a foundation. And that is, what is the foundation that allows you to decide what is right and what is wrong? What is acceptable? What is unacceptable? And the problem that I've noticed is we end up with these moral discussions about right and wrong, and we've never set foundations. And what happens is we don't have a discussion. We have two discussions that are totally unrelated. And they're coming from a whole different viewpoint than what you're coming. So you're using the same words, but you're coming not only to different conclusions, you are coming from a different world, a different viewpoint, a different foundation of what you're going to have. So what happens is, I've quit having the moral discussions. I found out sitting at Starbucks trying to decide whether homosexuality is acceptable or unacceptable, it doesn't work. I can make them mad, but that's not my purpose as a preacher. And so I began thinking, why is this not working? What am I saying that makes people so angry? What am I doing that, can I not communicate anymore? And the answer is, no, you're doing just fine. It's just you're so far apart that you need to start on something different. Now, how do you make a moral standard? And the answer is, you have to have a foundation. What is the basis of saying something is right or something is wrong? And if you'll follow the logic back, because just pretend you're a 3-year-old. And you know the favorite question of a 3-year-old. Why? Well, I think that's wrong. Why? And when you ask why 3 times, you've exhausted people's knowledge and intelligence, and they can't go any further than 3 whys. But that's okay, because I hope they ask me why. Because what I want to do is I want to back up 3 times, and I want to get back to where the why actually begins. And where the why begins is God. First, last, and ending. Everything that we believe that has any meaning whatsoever has to be foundation upon the very existence and character of God. It's not just his existence, but that has to be. Now, we live in a world, for example, Carl Sagan, you remember his billions and billions and billions of years when he did his TV series. And the problem is he said, basically, there is no God, period. Material, earth, sun, dust, that's all there is. It's all there's ever been. And that means that there is no such thing as spirit, and there is no such thing really as consciousness and conscience, and there's no understanding of personality of people, that it's all a material-based viewpoint. And the problem with that is, a friend of mine asked this question: how do you get to ought from is? That's a stupid question, but I get a lot of stupid friends. So what he meant by that is this. Somebody says, you shouldn't do that. Why not? Who made you king? Who gets to say, you get to make the rules of what I should do? Well, when you take Carl Sagan's position, there are no shoulds. All there is. The world is. People is. I know it's hard, but anyway. The point that I'm getting at, it just is. So when you begin talking, for example, about rape, just to use a disgusting concept, rape just is. In a world where there is no God, a world where there is no absolute right and wrong, that it's all based on materialism, unfortunately, that's what you have to say. But you know, you say the same thing about murder. It just is. Now, y'all live around here, and you see this all the time. You have much more nature than we do down in Arizona. But nobody gets really upset when the bear kills the little caribou. Well, some of you may, but get over it. Bears got to eat, and that's the way they eat. But now, it comes totally different when my neighbor decides to kill my children. Well, why is it different? Who says it's different? And my point is, we have these moral discussions about what is acceptable, but we're talking to people that no longer understand the nature and the character of God. In fact, my understanding in talking with so many people around Arizona and China and places that I hold meetings, they have a caricature of God, not an understanding of God. And the problem with a caricature of God is basically what they've done is that they have thrown their impression of God, and that becomes God. I told somebody one time, just between you and me, I hate peanut butter. And so does God. And they go, God hates peanut butter? I said, yes. I am an intelligent, logical, reasonable being. God is an intelligent, logical, reasonable being. And being that, and I hate peanut butter, God must hate peanut butter. It's just a logical conclusion that you have to draw. Now, you all see the problem with that? I don't care how logical that may seem to you. It just has no foundation at all in the nature and character of God. Some years ago, I decided I was going to preach a series on the nature and character of God, because I went back through my sermons, and for 20 some odd years, and I looked and I just had not talked about the nature and the character of God very much. So I did what any sensible, reasonable, logical person would do. I got out a catalog of our brethren's books, and I was going to just buy some very astute writings by our brethren on the nature and character of God, and I didn't find any. There were 2 little class books, and they didn't tell you much about God at all. And that was all that was in the catalog. I said, huh. So I went and I went down to a normal bookstore and I began looking, and they had 3. And finally I started going through old used books. Now, you get back into the end of the 1800s, and there's all kinds of books on the nature and the character of God. But we don't preach on that anymore. And people don't know the nature and the character of God. And so when we talk about morals, what we really have to talk about is the nature of God and His character. We're going to have another lesson on that, so I'm not going to do that this morning. But basically, I'm just going to tell you that God is God, and God gets to say what's right and wrong. And so, you and I, we sit in a Bible class, and somebody says, is that right or wrong? And somebody says, well, read 1 Corinthians 6, verse 10 through 11. And we read that, and we go, solved our problem. Well, you go down to Starbucks, and they ask the same question, and you pull out a Bible, and they say, what are you doing with that? Well, I'm going to read 1 Corinthians. Why? And then they want to argue about whether Corinthians ought to be in the book at all, whether you ought to even look at the book. And my point is, we can't have this conversation. So, what makes something wrong with God? Is it just our understanding of God? Do I have a right to tell you that God hates peanut butter? And therefore you ought not ever eat peanut butter? And the answer is, how do we know? So we begin having a problem. Keith, what's in my hand? $1. Nate? I don't know. Let's see, Nate's smarter than Keith. Nate just says, all no. Now, here's the funny part. I'm not going to tell you. So now, you're going to go through the rest of your life wondering what was in his hand. Now, I don't know why you're all wondering. I know what was in my hand. No man knows the thoughts of another man except the spirit of man that is within him, unless that man reveals it. And when we talk about revealing that, this is the same problem, because no man knows the thoughts of God. If we don't know the thoughts of each other, then how can I assume that I know the thoughts of God? Nate's an intelligent person, but he's not God. He knows a lot of stuff, but he knows nothing compared to the mind of God. And so we begin projecting upon God our own human frailties and likes and dislikes, and that's where our American society is today. And that's all we're doing. We're arguing about what we like and not really what God likes. Where do you find what God likes? And the answer is the fact that God has revealed himself unto man. And that revelation, we begin seeing essences of it. How many of you noticed that our children learn to talk? And a really funny part to me about them learning to talk is they learn to talk and use language long before they ever learn about language. That is, they don't know verbs from nouns. And I was over listening to my children one time. They were talking, and a friend of theirs had to go to the doctor, and my son very intelligently said, yeah, and the doctor's going to doctorate on him. And you know what he did? He was using language. He was using principles and concepts of language. And he made up a word, you know, a plumber plums, a preacher preaches, a doctor. It's very logical. And we use language and we use concepts because God created man, not only in God's image, but with the ability to communicate, with the purpose that God was going to communicate with mankind. And there's really two ways that God could communicate with mankind. One is he could simply talk to each one of you. most of us would probably be scared to death if we heard the voice of God. What do you think the voice of God sounds like? Don nods. No. That's not what it's going to sound like. But my point is, God doesn't just talk to us. God doesn't just verbally, when you start to do something, say, don't do that. Wouldn't that be? You wouldn't have to think. God would just be there all the time. But the problem with that is that then there is no love on your part. There's no trust on your part. I took computer language, and I was learning how to program just for the fun of that. And the first thing that all computer programmers learned when we first started this was you programmed your computer that when you punched a button, it responded to you. And so we were all instructed that when you punch this button, it says, I love you. And so I punched the button and my computer screen said, I love you. And I went, isn't that nice? My computer loves me. And you all realize, no, it doesn't. It's a machine. It's responding the way it's programmed. Well, you're not a machine. You're not a computer. You are programmed to be yourself. And this is the thing about love. Love cannot be forced. Love cannot be coerced. Love cannot be commanded from another. What happens is love is a response that you decide, that you control, that you do. And so in our relationship with God, we are not programmed, and so we respond to God. And the way God did that was God used language, and He talked with us. And you all remember the story of Adam and Eve. All of the trees of the garden are yours. You can eat of them, but don't eat of that one. And so what God did was He elicited from them, they had to respond. Yes or no? They had to respond. Trust or not trust. And since that time, God then, as the people multiplied, rather than talk to each person individually, now just to show you how this works. Imagine if what we decided to do this morning, instead of you all being in the same room listening to me talk at one time, why didn't we just meet individually one at a time and let me explain this to you? Now, first of all, I'd have to explain the same thing 50 times. Or we can do it once. So what God did was He chose to do it in a written form. And He chose and commanded Moses to write these things down. He commanded Joshua, write these things down. He commanded Paul, write these things down. And the apostles, when they began having to deal with all of these people, Luke says, I've studied all of these and I've written this down that you might know assuredly the things that are believed by the early Christians. And so what God did was, our foundation, He gave us a book. Now, question. What makes marriage right or wrong? And my answer is, God said. Now I'm going to come back to that in another lesson and just talk about the nature of the Bible and how we got it and how that fits into our lives. But for you that are here this morning, that's the second part of the foundation. And so to talk about any moral subject, you and I are going to come from the viewpoint the book says. The rest of the world hadn't read the book. And even if you read it to them, they don't believe the book. So what good does it do to have this discussion up here about moral choices and moral standards when they don't believe the standard? What discussion really needs to be had is not the one up in the red box with the moral discussions, but down here, what are we going to use to decide what is right and what is wrong? And I'm going to tell you, that discussion we need to have a lot more today. 200 years ago, almost everybody in America knew the Bible, and they had respect for the Bible. They didn't all follow it, and some of them liked to change certain parts of it, but by and large, our society was built upon a biblical concept. Today, our political leaders can't even misquote the Bible. let alone quote it right, because they've never read it. They don't spend time with it. It's not part of our vocabulary. And so our world is changing because our standards have changed. The foundation has changed. Now, you move then from God's Word, and you have to have two discussions, really, on the nature of God. And that is, number one, that this actually is an inspired book. That is, God is the background author of the book. I know Luke wrote Luke and Paul wrote Ephesians, but God was behind their writings of those individual books. Well, why, if God wrote all of the book, why doesn't the book all sound the same? And the answer is because God used the writers of the individual books, their vocabulary, their personalities. When I was studying Greek, when I began, we always started with 1 John. And every Greek book I've ever had starts with 1 John. You all know why? John's vocabulary is very simple, as opposed to Paul. And so Paul's vocabulary in the book of Romans, you really need to know about 3 or 4 years of Greek before you get there. And because Paul was dealing with something different than what John was dealing with, just different. So God inspired both John and Paul and Luke and Isaiah and Amos to write these books. But the second conversation that you have when you talk about this foundation is the fact was, well, how do we know that what we have today is the same teaching of what they had back then? And that is a huge discussion that goes on today. I don't know if you all like to watch all of the specials on PBS and the History Channel, but they have all of these, and the people that are the spokesmen do not believe what you believe. They don't believe that the Bible has been preserved. They believe that it's been changed. They believe it. One of the favorite illustrations is that old game of telephone that we used to play as teenagers. And you whisper in somebody's ear, and they whisper in somebody's ear. And I don't know about you, but I always changed it just to have fun with the party. And you get to the end, and they're going, "How did we get here?" You know how you got there. Well, is that how it worked with the Bible? And the answer is not at all. It's not even close to the same illustration. But what we have is those discussions. Now, if you're not prepared for that discussion, you'll never have a good discussion on the concept of morals. Because you're coming from a whole different viewpoint of God, Bible, world, morality. So a third foundation that you and I have, and this has really been challenged in the last 150 years. We just had the Lord's Supper. Why? And the answer is because we believe that Jesus was raised from the dead. And so we do this as often as you do this in remembrance of me, until I come. Oh, wait a minute. He's dead. He ain't coming. No, he's very much alive. They killed him, and they entombed him, and he rose from the dead and is seated at the right hand of God and is King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And so we make disciples, teaching them to observe all things whatsoever He commanded of us. You see, we're weird. We're peculiar. We're coming from a different ballpark. But when you talk about the resurrection of Jesus, Jesus wasn't kind of raised. Now you stop and think about this. He's not a zombie. He's not part of that whole TV culture, the stuff, that he kind of came back, How does that work? The body without a brain? Be a teenager. What are we talking about? And the answer is, no, he was raised. The body died. And God made it alive. And when God made it alive, it changed everything. Now, when we are baptized, We proclaim to the world, I believe in the resurrection of Jesus, because we are buried with him in baptism, and we are raised to walk in newness of life. As he was raised, so we are raised. And so we proclaim the resurrection every Sunday in the Lord's Supper. We proclaim the resurrection because every disciple is baptized into Jesus. And I don't know whether you ever noticed this. Every sermon in the book of Acts talks about the resurrection of Jesus. They didn't preach morals. Paul didn't go into Corinth and talk about homosexuality. He went into Corinth and he talked about the resurrection of Jesus. Why? Why didn't he talk about morals? And the answer is, you have to have the same foundation. And if you don't have that same foundation, you can't have an intelligent conversation about the morality of the people. So take a look at all the sermons in the book of Acts. And they are not the discussions that you and I are having with our neighbors. But I believe they are the discussion we ought to be having with our neighbors. And so rather than talking about the moral thing, I want to take them back and talk about the nature of God. I had a discussion going with a man one time. He asked me about instrumental music. And he found out that we just sang, and he thought that was kind of weird. And so I said, well, and we were standing in line to check out, and I said, you know, this is not the place to have the discussion, but I'll be glad to talk with you about it. Why don't you let me come over to your house Monday night, and we can talk as long as you want to, and I can explain this. And he said, okay. Usually they say no. They're not really interested in knowing, so you've solved that problem rather than arguing about it at the Safeway checkout line. Now, I went over and I spent hours with this fellow. And I walked him through the nature of the Bible and the nature of authority and how you establish what God wants us to do. And then I showed him all of the passages. And when I got done, he says, you know, I think you're right about that. But it really doesn't matter. I don't think there's a God. What have I been doing? I have this discussion going about what is acceptable in worship to God. And I needed to go back to our first foundation. Because it really did make a whit of difference. So, if somebody doesn't believe in the resurrection of Jesus, does it really matter how they live? If they don't believe in the existence of God, does it really matter that they think this is an acceptable behavior pattern? And the answer is no. In the scheme of things, it doesn't matter. Without faith, y'all quote this with me, Hebrews chapter 11, verse 6. Without faith, it's impossible to please God. For he that comes to God must believe God is, and that God is a rewarder of those that diligently seek him. Y'all know that verse? Now that verse tells you two things. Number one, it doesn't matter what they're doing, they can't be right with God until they set the foundation. And the foundation had 2 parts. Not just the existence of God, although you have to believe that, but the character of God, that he is a rewarder of those that diligently. That's speaking of God's character, God's faithfulness, God's interaction. So now, if we've gotten this far, maybe we can have a discussion on morals. Why do you think that's wrong? Jesus said so. Okay. Now, as far as you and me, I'm done. I believe that. So I'm not going to do that. You're wrong. But now there's one other section here that I have found gets in the way. And it is one of the biggest items on unbelievers' lists. Y'all want to know what it is? You're all hypocrites. Yes. If by hypocrite you mean, I believe this, but I don't live up to it. Because God's standard is up here. And I'll just be freely to tell you. I know much more than I do. and so do you. And so as we begin interacting with the world that we live in, one of the things that we need to be aware of and conscious of is just how we're going to do this. Now I'm going to skip over all of these things that we want to talk about later in the week, just a preview. We believe in the resurrection of Jesus because of all of these. But now above that, why do I expect my neighbor to follow the teaching of Jesus if I won't? Why do I want to debate with my neighbor about living the moral standards of the Bible if I don't? Thou that teachest another, said Paul in Romans chapter 2. Do you not teach yourself? You that would say. Well, and that's where we are. And so we have to build these foundations. Now, when we've done the foundational building here, now we can have a discussion on morals. Now we can talk about marriage, we can talk about adultery, we can talk about drunkenness, we can talk about anything that you want to talk about. But we will have the same discussion because we're coming from the same foundation. So rather than having the argument about adultery or just living together as so many young people do, that's not the problem. The problem is the foundation. So all week, this is all I'm going to talk about. And it's going to be stuff you already know. I'm going to bore you to death. But I just want you to understand, these are the important factors of life. What are you going to teach your children? I'm going to tell you, ground them in the foundation. If you teach them just what to believe, you're in trouble. Because they're going to leave home and they're not going to listen to you anymore. They're going to go to college or somewhere and their friends, and they're going to, now all they know is to believe what I'm told. Rather, we need to teach them how to think. And when we teach them how to think, we have to give them the tools so that they can think. And the tools are the foundation of our whole thinking process, our moral values. And so we have a big job with our children, teaching them these foundational people. There's a workbook, A Generation That Knew Not God. And very, very good workbook, but it's an interesting thing. You realize, for example, in the book of Judges, it was second generation. And they were awful. And you start reading through 1st and 2nd Kings, and what you see is the children were not faithful. And what's happened is we're having the same problem today in church after church after church. And our young people grow up and they leave. Now many of them, after they experience a little life, they come back. What we have to do is ground them. And we have to ground them in these foundational principles. Because sooner or later, Robert Turner, if you all never got to hear him preach, he missed a great teacher. But he made a statement in the middle of a sermon one time, and I like to quote that. God has no grandchildren. And for you that are grandparents, enjoy it. But you are either related to God personally, directly, individually, or you're not related at all. You're not a Christian because Daddy was a Christian. God has no grandchildren. So we need to teach our children. Because they're going to have this debate. They're already having this debate. They're already dealing with it in their schools. They're having to confront this by their teachers and their workbooks and their textbooks. They're already seeing it on the television. The amount of misinformation about the moral standards is overwhelming. And we have to have this foundation. So that's where we're going this week. We're just going to talk about how to establish these and what does the Bible say and where can we go and how do we have this conversation. Now, if you're not a Christian, I'm going to tell you the way you become a Christian, because the Bible says so, is that you need to believe that Jesus was raised from the dead, and believing that you need to repent and you need to be baptized in the name of Jesus. Mark chapter 16, teach this, the resurrection, to all creatures. He that believes and is baptized shall they say. Why? God said so. You know, it's an interesting thing. Nobody ever argued that in the Bible. Nobody ever argued. I don't need to do that. Now, some of them refused to do it, but it was not because they argued, I can believe without this. It just didn't happen. But it happens today. What happened? We've changed our foundations. We've changed our viewpoint of how the Bible teaches. But if you're here this morning, I want you to believe. I want you to have this foundation. And that means believing, being baptized, because Jesus said so. If you're willing to do that, we invite you to come. We stand and sing.